The acrid smell of smoke was the first thing that jolted me awake. At first, I thought it was just a bad dream, the kind that leaves you gasping for air and drenched in sweat. But as I blinked away the haze of sleep, the harsh reality hit me like a freight train. This wasn't a nightmare. It was happening. The smoke was real, thick and suffocating, seeping under our bedroom door like an ominous fog. I reached out, my hand fumbling in the darkness until it found Tom's shoulder. "Tom," I whispered, my voice hoarse from the smoke already invading my lungs. "Tom, wake up. Something's wrong." He stirred, mumbling incoherently at first, but then I felt his body tense as awareness dawned on him too. We locked eyes in the dim light, fear mirrored in both our faces. That's when we heard it, the unmistakable roar of flames, punctuated by the panicked shouts of our neighbors. "Fire!" The cry came from outside, muffled but urgent. "Everyone out! Fire!" We sprang into action, adrenaline coursing through our veins. There was no time to think, no time to plan. Survival instinct took over. Tom grabbed our phones from the nightstand while I snatched up my purse, stuffing in whatever important documents I could find in our bedside drawer. The cat! I suddenly remembered, my heart racing even faster. "Where's Milo?" As if on cue, our tabby darted out from under the bed, his eyes wide with terror. I scooped him up, ignoring his panicked claws digging into my arms. Tom was already at the door, his hand hovering over the doorknob. "Wait," I said, remembering what I'd learned about house fires. I pressed the back of my hand against the door. It was warm, but not scalding. "Okay, let's go." Tom opened the door, and a wall of smoke hit us. We dropped low, crawling on our hands and knees. The heat was intense, pressing down on us like a physical weight. I could hear the crackle and pop of wood being devoured by flames, a sound that would haunt my dreams for months to come. Our small apartment had never felt so vast. Every inch we crawled felt like a mile, each second stretching into an eternity. I clutched Milo to my chest with one arm, using the other to pull myself forward. Tom led the way, navigating us through the smoke-filled hallway. When we finally reached the front door, Tom struggled with the lock, his hands shaking. Come on," he muttered, his voice tight with fear. After what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, the door swung open, and we tumbled out into the cold night air. The scene outside was chaos. Neighbors in various states of undress huddled together on the street, some crying, others shouting. Fire trucks wailed in the distance, their sirens growing louder with each passing moment. And there, in the center of it all, was our building, our home, engulfed in flames. The fire was relentless, consuming everything in its path. Orange flames licked at the windows, black smoke billowing into the night sky. It was beautiful in a terrible way, mesmerizing in its destruction. I stood there, wrapped in nothing but my thin nightgown, Milo trembling in my arms, and watched as everything we owned turned to ash. Our wedding photos, carefully arranged on the mantel. The antique writing desk that had been passed down through Tom's family for generations. The half-finished painting I'd been working on, a surprise anniversary gift for Tom. All of it, gone in a matter of minutes. Firefighters arrived, their trucks screeching to a halt in front of our building. They leapt into action, unrolling hoses and shouting orders. But even as they fought valiantly against the inferno, I knew in my heart it was too late. There was nothing left to save. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of our situation started to sink in. We were alive, yes, but we had nothing. No clothes beyond what we wore, no food, no shelter. The crushing realization that we had nowhere to go hit me like a physical blow, nearly knocking me off my feet. Tom must have sensed my distress because he wrapped an arm around my shoulders, pulling me close. "We'll figure it out," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "We're okay. That's what matters." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. We were okay, but what now? Where would we go? What would we do? As if reading my thoughts, Tom spoke again. "We could call my mom," he suggested hesitantly. "She's not too far. Maybe we could stay with her for a few days until we figure things out." I tensed at the suggestion. Tom's mother and I had a complicated relationship, to put it mildly. She'd never quite approved of me, always hinting that her precious son could do better. But as I looked around at the chaos surrounding us, at our neighbors huddled together for warmth, at the firefighters still battling the blaze, I realized we didn't have much choice. Okay, I agreed reluctantly. Let's call her. Tom pulled out his phone, miraculously unscathed, and dialed his mother's number. As he spoke to her in hushed tones, explaining our situation, I turned my attention back to the fire. It seemed to be dying down now, the flames retreating as the firefighters gained the upper hand. But the damage was done. Our home, our sanctuary, was nothing more than a charred skeleton. A paramedic approached us, asking if we needed medical attention. I shook my head, realizing for the first time that I was shivering violently. The paramedic draped a blanket over my shoulders, gently coaxing me to sit down on the back of an ambulance. Shock, he explained kindly. It's perfectly normal after what you've been through. Just try to take deep breaths. I nodded mutely, clutching the blanket tighter around myself and Milo. Tom finished his call and joined me, his face etched with worry and exhaustion. Mom said we can come, he reported. She's getting the guest room ready. I tried to muster up some gratitude, but all I felt was a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. We sat there in silence as the night wore on, watching as the fire was finally extinguished and the crowd of onlookers slowly dispersed. Dawn was breaking by the time we were allowed to approach the building. The fire marshal, a kind-faced man with salt and pepper hair, walked us through what remained of our apartment. The damage was even worse up close. Everything was charred beyond recognition, covered in a thick layer of soot. The acrid smell of smoke clung to everything, making my eyes water and my throat burn. The fire started in the apartment below yours, the marshal explained. Faulty wiring, from what we can tell. You're lucky you woke up when you did. Lucky. The word echoed in my mind. Were we lucky? We'd lost everything. But then I looked at Tom, saw the relief in his eyes as he squeezed my hand, and I knew. Yes, we were lucky. We were alive. As we turned to leave, something caught my eye. There, miraculously untouched amidst the destruction, was a small ceramic figurine. It was a little cat, painted to look just like Milo. Tom had given it to me on our first anniversary, a silly little gift that had made me laugh with joy. I picked it up, cradling it gently in my palm. It was warm to the touch, but intact. A small piece of our life, our love, salvaged from the ashes. Tears welled up in my eyes as I showed it to Tom. Look, I whispered. It survived. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time since we'd been awakened by the smoke. Just like us, he said softly. As we made our way out of the ruined building, that little figurine clutched tightly in my hand, I felt a glimmer of hope. We had lost so much, but we still had each other. We had survived. And somehow, someway, we would rebuild. But first, we had to face Tom's mother. As we climbed into a taxi, the address of her suburban home on our lips, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were trading one fire for another. Little did I know just how right that feeling would turn out to be. The taxi ride to Tom's mother's house in the suburbs of Boston was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The events of the night played on repeat in my mind, a horrifying loop of smoke, flames, and loss. I clutched the ceramic cat figurine in my hand, its smooth surface a small comfort amidst the chaos of our new reality. As we pulled up to the sprawling colonial-style house, I felt a knot form in the pit of my stomach. Sarah, Tom's mother, had never been my biggest fan. Our relationship was strained at best, openly hostile at worst. But surely, in this moment of crisis, she would set aside our differences and offer some compassion. Right? Tom paid the taxi driver, and we stepped out onto the perfectly manicured lawn. It was still early, the sun just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long shadows across the dew-covered grass. In any other circumstance, it might have been beautiful. Now, it just felt alien and cold. We approached the front door, our feet heavy with exhaustion. Tom raised his hand to knock, but before he could, the door swung open. Sarah stood there, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour, wrapped in an expensive-looking silk robe. Oh, Thomas, she breathed, her eyes widening as she took in our disheveled appearance. We must have been quite a sight, clothes rumpled and smelling of smoke, faces smudged with soot, Milo still cradled in my arms. Sarah's gaze swept over me, her lips pursing slightly as if she'd tasted something sour. "I see you brought everyone," she said, her tone making it clear that everyone meant me and the cat. Tom stepped forward, his voice rough with fatigue and emotion. "Mom, thank you for letting us come. We've lost everything." Something flickered in Sarah's eyes, pity, perhaps, or maybe just discomfort. She sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of great inconvenience, and opened the door wider. "You can come in, Thomas," she said, placing a hand on his arm. Then her gaze flicked to me, and with an icy detachment that sent chills down my spine, she added, "But if you want to stay, you'll have to pay $1,700 a month." The words hit me like a physical blow. I blinked, certain I must have misheard. But the look on Sarah's face, a mixture of smug satisfaction and cold indifference, told me I hadn't. "Mom," Tom exclaimed, his voice a mixture of shock and anger. "You can't be serious. We just lost our home. Everything we own is gone. How could you even think about charging us rent?" Sarah's expression didn't waver. "This isn't a charity, Thomas. I'm not running a homeless shelter. If she wants to stay here, she'll have to contribute." The emphasis she placed on she made it clear that this stipulation was meant for me alone. Tom was welcome. I was not. I stood there, frozen in disbelief. The ceramic cat figurine dug into my palm as I clenched my fist, fighting back tears of anger and humiliation. How could someone be so cruel, especially to their own son's wife in a moment of crisis? Tom looked between us, his face a mask of anguish. I could see the conflict in his eyes, torn between his love for me and his ingrained need to please his mother. In that moment, I realized with a sinking heart that he wasn't going to stand up to her. "Not really." "Mom, please," he tried again, his voice softer now, pleading. "Just for a few days. Until we can figure something out." But Sarah was unmoved. "I'm sorry, Thomas, but that's my final word on the matter. Your old room is available for you, of course. But if she stays, she pays." I couldn't take it anymore. The stress of the fire, the loss of our home, and now this blatant rejection, it was all too much. Without a word, I turned on my heel and walked away, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger, humiliation, and a strange sense of resolve. "Lena, wait." Tom called after me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't bear to see the indecision on his face, to watch him choose between his wife and his mother. Because deep down, I was afraid of what that choice might be. I walked down the pristine suburban street, no destination in mind, just a burning need to get away. The sun was fully up now, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. Joggers passed by, giving me curious looks. I must have been quite a sight, still in my nightgown, carrying a cat, my face streaked with tears and soot. After a few blocks, I found a small park and collapsed onto a bench. Milo, sensing my distress, curled up in my lap, purring softly. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching as the park came to life around me. Children laughed on the swings, their carefree joy a stark contrast to the turmoil in my heart. As the initial shock and anger began to fade, my mind started to race. What were we going to do? Where would we go? We had no clothes, no money, no home. The insurance would eventually pay out, but that could take weeks or even months. We needed a solution now. I thought about calling my own family, but they were halfway across the country in Arizona. Even if they could help, it would take days for us to get there. And the thought of leaving Boston, of admitting defeat and running back home with my tail between my legs, made my stomach churn. No, I decided. We weren't going to run. We weren't going to beg. We were going to find a solution, right here and now. With a newfound determination, I stood up, gently placing Milo on the ground beside me. He looked up at me with his big, green eyes, as if to say, "What's the plan, boss?" "We're going to the bank," I told him, feeling slightly ridiculous for talking to a cat but needing to voice my thoughts aloud. "We're going to figure this out." I made my way to the nearest branch of our bank, ignoring the strange looks I got from passers-by. As I walked, my mind raced with possibilities. I wasn't looking for a loan. I knew that with no collateral and no current income, that would be a dead end. No, I needed something else. I needed power. The bank had just opened when I arrived. The young teller looked startled as I approached, taking in my disheveled appearance with wide eyes. "I need to speak with the manager," I said, my voice hoarse but firm. "It's an emergency." Maybe it was the desperation in my eyes, or maybe it was just to get the crazy-looking woman out of the lobby, but the teller quickly ushered me into a private office. A middle-aged man in a crisp suit looked up as I entered, his eyebrows rising in surprise. "Mrs. Chin," he said, recognizing me from our occasional visits to the bank. "What happened? Are you all right?" I took a deep breath and launched into my story. I told him about the fire, about losing everything, about Sarah's cruel ultimatum. As I spoke, I could see the sympathy in his eyes, but also a wariness. He was waiting for the ask, for me to beg for a loan or some other financial assistance. But that wasn't why I was there. "Mr. Daniels," I said, leaning forward. "I'm not here to ask for money. I'm here to make a deal." His eyebrows rose even higher. "A deal?" I nodded, a plan forming in my mind even as I spoke. "I know that banks often have properties that have been foreclosed on. Properties that are just sitting there, costing you money. What if I could help you with that?" Mr. Daniels leaned back in his chair, his interest piqued. "Go on." Over the next hour, we talked. I laid out a proposal. I would help the bank stage and market their foreclosed properties, making them more appealing to potential buyers. In return, they would allow us to live in one of these properties temporarily rent-free. It was a long shot, I knew. But as I spoke, I could see the wheels turning in Mr. Daniels' head. He asked questions, raised concerns, but he didn't dismiss the idea outright. "It's an unusual request," he said finally. "I'll need to run it by corporate. But it's not without merit. Give me a day or two to see what I can do." I left the bank feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time since the fire. It wasn't a solution yet, but it was a start. As I stepped out onto the street, I realized I had no idea where to go next. I couldn't go back to Sarah's house. My pride wouldn't allow it. And I couldn't bear the thought of Tom choosing his mother over me. Just then, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my friend, Rachel. "Heard about the fire. Are you okay? Do you need a place to stay?" I felt tears prick my eyes, overwhelmed by the simple kindness. I quickly typed back a response, accepting her offer gratefully. As I made my way to Rachel's apartment, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I had a plan now, or at least the beginnings of one. I would find us a place to stay. I would rebuild our lives. And I would show Sarah that I wasn't someone to be discarded so easily. Little did I know that my actions over the next few days would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. The fire had taken our home, but it had also ignited something in me, a determination, a fire of my own. And soon, it would be my turn to change someone else's fate. As I arrived at Rachel's apartment, I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the challenges ahead. The ceramic cat figurine was still clutched in my hand, a reminder of what we'd lost, but also of what had survived. We had made it through the fire. Now it was time to rise from the ashes. Rachel's apartment was a small, cozy one-bedroom in the heart of Boston. As I stepped inside, the familiar scent of vanilla and cinnamon enveloped me, a stark contrast to the acrid smell of smoke that had clung to me for hours. Rachel, her red hair tied back in a messy bun, took one look at me and pulled me into a tight hug. "Oh, Lena," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, I allowed myself to crumble. The tears I had been holding back since leaving Sarah's house finally spilled over, and I sobbed into Rachel's shoulder. She held me, murmuring words of comfort, until the storm passed. When I finally pulled away, wiping my eyes with the back of my hand, Rachel led me to her small bathroom. "Take a shower," she instructed gently. "I'll find you some clean clothes. We're about the same size, it should work." The hot water was a blessing, washing away the soot and the smell of smoke. As I stood under the spray, I tried to wash away the memory of Sarah's cold eyes, her cruel ultimatum. But no matter how hard I scrubbed, I couldn't erase the hurt and betrayal I felt. Dressed in Rachel's borrowed clothes, soft yoga pants, and an oversized sweater, I felt almost human again. Rachel had made coffee and toast, and we sat at her tiny kitchen table, Milo curled up contentedly at my feet. "So," Rachel said, her green eyes filled with concern. "What happened with Tom's mom? I thought you were staying there." I took a deep breath and recounted the morning's events. Rachel's eyes widened in disbelief as I told her about Sarah's demand for rent. "That bitch," she muttered, shaking her head. "I can't believe she'd do that to you, especially now." I shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant even as the hurt threatened to overwhelm me again. "It's not entirely surprising. She's never liked me. I guess I just thought, in a crisis." Rachel reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "And Tom? What did he do?" The question I had been dreading. I stared into my coffee cup, unable to meet Rachel's eyes. He didn't do anything. Not really. He tried to talk to her, but I trailed off, the weight of Tom's inaction settling heavily on my shoulders. Rachel's grip on my hand tightened. "Lena," she said softly. "You know that's not okay, right? He should have stood up for you." I nodded, tears pricking at my eyes again. "I know. I don't know what to do now. We've lost everything, Rachel. Our home, our belongings, and now, maybe even our marriage." Rachel was quiet for a moment, her brow furrowed in thought. "What about your family? Could you stay with them for a while?" I shook my head. "They're in Arizona. Even if we could get there, the thought of running back home like this. I can't do it. I won't." "So what's your plan?" I told her about my visit to the bank, about the deal I was trying to make. Rachel listened intently, her eyes widening as I explained my idea. "Lena, that's actually brilliant," she said when I finished. "Do you think it'll work?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But it's the best shot we have right now. I just need to figure out how to make it happen." Rachel nodded, a determined look on her face. "Okay then, let's make it happen." Over the next 2 days, Rachel's apartment became our command center. We worked tirelessly, reaching out to contacts, researching real estate trends, and putting together a comprehensive proposal for the bank. Rachel, who worked in marketing, helped me create sleek presentations and eye-catching mock-ups of how we could stage the foreclosed properties. I called in every favor I could think of. My old college roommate, now a successful interior designer, agreed to consult on the project pro bono. A former colleague who had moved into real estate offered insights into the local market. Even the owner of the small art gallery where I occasionally showed my paintings chipped in, offering to lend artwork to stage the homes. As we worked, I tried not to think about Tom. He had called and texted multiple times, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. The hurt and betrayal were still too raw. Each time my phone buzzed with his name, I felt a mixture of longing and anger that threatened to derail my focus. On the morning of the 3rd day, I received a call from Mr. Daniels at the bank. My heart raced as I answered, acutely aware that everything hinged on this conversation. "Mrs. Chin," Mr. Daniels said, his tone unreadable. "I've discussed your proposal with our corporate office." I held my breath, bracing for rejection. But then, "We're interested," he continued. "It's an unconventional approach, but given the current market, we're willing to give it a try. On a trial basis, of course." Relief flooded through me, so intense that for a moment, I couldn't speak. Rachel, seeing my expression, gave me a thumbs up and a wide smile. "Thank you, Mr. Daniels," I finally managed to say. "You won't regret this. When can we start?" We arranged a meeting for the following day to go over the details. As I hung up the phone, I felt a surge of triumph. It wasn't just about having a place to stay anymore. This was about proving that I wasn't someone to be discarded so easily. Sarah had thought she could push me aside, but I was about to show her just how wrong she was. That afternoon, as Rachel and I were celebrating our small victory with a bottle of cheap wine, my phone buzzed again. It was Tom. This time, instead of ignoring it, I answered. "Lena," he breathed, relief evident in his voice. Thank God. I've been so worried. Where are you? Are you okay? I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I'm fine, Tom. I'm staying with Rachel. Why didn't you come back? He asked, a note of hurt in his voice. I've been looking everywhere for you. The anger I had been suppressing bubbled to the surface. Come back? To where, Tom? To your mother's house, where I'm not welcome unless I pay an exorbitant rent. To you, who couldn't even stand up for me. There was a long pause. When Tom spoke again, his voice was small, defeated. I'm sorry, Lena. I should have done more. I didn't know what to do. Mom was being unreasonable, but she's still my mom, you know. I closed my eyes, fighting back tears. And I'm your wife, Tom. Or have you forgotten that? Of course not, he said quickly. I love you, Lena. Please, just come back. We'll figure this out together. I wanted to believe him. Part of me longed to run back into his arms, to let him comfort me and tell me everything would be okay. But I couldn't shake the memory of his silence in the face of his mother's cruelty. I can't, Tom, I said softly. Not right now. I need some time. Time for what? He asked, a note of panic creeping into his voice. I thought about the deal with the bank, about the plan that was forming in my mind. A plan that would not only secure us a place to live, but would also show Sarah that I wasn't as powerless as she thought. Time to fix this, I said. On my own terms. As I hung up the phone, I felt a mix of emotions. Sadness at the distance between Tom and me, anger at the situation we were in, but also a fierce determination. I had lost so much in the fire, but I was beginning to realize that from those ashes, something new was emerging. A stronger, more resilient version of myself. Rachel, who had been pretending not to listen to my conversation, gave me a sympathetic look. You okay? I nodded, surprising myself with how true it felt. Yeah, I think I am. For the first time since the fire, I feel like I have a purpose. Like I'm taking control. She smiled, raising her wine glass in a toast. To taking control, she said. I clinked my glass against hers, but in my mind, I was already moving on to the next phase of my plan. The deal with the bank was just the beginning. Now, I needed to ensure that Sarah understood the consequences of her actions. Over the next few days, I threw myself into work. The bank provided us with a list of their foreclosed properties, and Rachel and I set about transforming them. We painted, we staged, we photographed. With each home we worked on, I felt a sense of accomplishment, of forward momentum. But even as I worked, a part of my mind was always plotting, always planning. I had access to financial information now, records of properties and mortgages. And as I dug deeper, I began to uncover things. Interesting things. Things about Sarah's financial situation that she probably wouldn't want anyone to know. It started small, a missed payment here, a late fee there. But as I dug deeper, a pattern emerged. Sarah, for all her airs of wealth and superiority, was in trouble. Deep trouble. Her perfectly manicured life was built on a foundation of debt and overextended credit. The realization hit me like a thunderbolt. Sarah wasn't just cruel, she was desperate. Her demand for rent wasn't just about making my life difficult, it was about keeping her own head above water. For a moment, I felt a twinge of sympathy. But then I remembered the cold look in her eyes as she shut the door in my face, the way she had so casually dismissed me in my hour of need. And any sympathy I might have felt evaporated. I had the power now. The question was, what would I do with it? As I sat in Rachel's apartment that night, Milo curled up beside me, I made my decision. I wouldn't expose Sarah's financial troubles, not directly. But I would use this information to my advantage. To secure a future for Tom and me, yes. But also to teach Sarah a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. The fire had taken our home, but now it was my turn to change someone else's fate. And as I closed my eyes that night, I couldn't help but smile. The game was about to change, and Sarah had no idea what was coming. The irony wasn't lost on me as I stood across the street from Sarah's house, watching the scene unfold. 3 days after she had slammed the door in my face, her perfectly manicured world was crumbling around her. Not by flames, but by something far more destructive: consequences. I had spent the last few days in a whirlwind of activity. Working with the bank, I had successfully negotiated a deal that not only provided Tom and me with temporary housing, but also gave me access to a wealth of financial information. It was this information that had led me here to this moment. The morning was crisp, the air carrying the first hint of autumn. Leaves rustled in the trees lining the suburban street, a few early turners adding splashes of red and gold to the green canopy. It would have been beautiful if not for the tension hanging in the air. I watched as a sleek black car pulled up in front of Sarah's house. Two men in sharp suits emerged, briefcases in hand. Even from across the street, I could see the official logos emblazoned on the sides, representatives from the bank. My heart raced as I saw Sarah open the door. She was impeccably dressed as always, her silver hair coiffed to perfection. But even from this distance, I could see the strain in her face, the tightness around her eyes that betrayed her anxiety. The men spoke to her briefly on the doorstep before she ushered them inside. I imagined the scene playing out, Sarah offering them tea in her finest china, trying to maintain the illusion of control even as her world collapsed around her. I hadn't planned to be here for this. In fact, I had told myself I wouldn't come, that I would let the events I had set in motion play out without my presence. But something had drawn me here, a need to see with my own eyes the results of my actions. As I stood there, a flood of memories washed over me. The countless dinners at this very house where Sarah had made snide comments about my background, my career choices, my worthiness as a partner for her precious son. The way she had looked at me that morning after the fire, with cold indifference in the face of our tragedy. A part of me felt guilty. Was I any better than her, orchestrating her downfall like this? But then I remembered her cruelty, her callousness when we were at our most vulnerable. No, I decided. This wasn't revenge, it was justice. I was so lost in thought that I almost missed Tom's arrival. His car pulled up behind the bank representative's vehicle, and he got out, his face a mask of confusion and concern. He must have received the same urgent call from Sarah that had prompted my presence here. For a moment, our eyes met across the street. I saw recognition flash across his face, followed quickly by a mix of emotions I couldn't quite decipher: relief, confusion, maybe even a hint of accusation. He took a step towards me, but then seemed to think better of it, turning instead to hurry into the house. I debated leaving then. I had seen what I came to see, confirmed that the wheels I had set in motion were turning. But something kept me rooted to the spot. A need to see this through to the end, perhaps. Or maybe just morbid curiosity. Time seemed to stretch as I waited. The neighborhood came to life around me, people leaving for work, kids heading to school, joggers making their morning rounds. A few gave me curious looks as they passed, probably wondering why I was standing stock still on the sidewalk, staring at a house. But I barely noticed them. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only about 45 minutes, the front door opened again. The bank representatives emerged first, their faces impassive. They got into their car without a backward glance and drove away. Then came Sarah and Tom. Sarah's carefully constructed facade had crumbled. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. She clutched a stack of papers in her hand so tightly her knuckles were white. Tom had his arm around her shoulders, his face a picture of shock and disbelief. As they stood on the porch, Sarah suddenly looked up, her eyes locking with mine across the street. For a moment, I saw a flash of the old Sarah, proud, defiant, angry. But then something changed. Recognition dawned in her eyes, followed by a look of dawning horror. She knew. Somehow, she had figured out my role in this. I expected to feel triumphant in this moment. I had imagined it so many times over the past few days, Sarah realizing that I wasn't as powerless as she had thought, that I could affect her life just as much as she had affected mine. But now, faced with the reality, all I felt was a hollow ache in my chest. Tom followed his mother's gaze, his eyes widening as he saw me again. This time, he didn't hesitate. He said something quickly to Sarah and then jogged across the street towards me. "Lena," he said as he reached me, his voice a mixture of relief and confusion. "What are you doing here? How did you know?" He trailed off, realization dawning on his face. Did you have something to do with this?" I met his gaze steadily. I did what I had to do, Tom. For us. For our future. His brow furrowed. What are you talking about? Lena, the bank is foreclosing on Mom's house. They're saying she's been behind on payments for months, that she's drowning in debt. How could you possibly have anything to do with that? I took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth. I made a deal with the bank, Tom, to help them sell off foreclosed properties. In the process, I found out some things about your mother's financial situation. Tom's eyes widened. And you, what? Reported her? Pushed for this? I didn't have to, I said softly. The foreclosure was already in process. I just accelerated things a bit. Made sure the right people saw the right information at the right time. Tom took a step back, running a hand through his hair in frustration. I can't believe this. Lena, how could you? She's my mother. And I'm your wife. I snapped, years of pent-up frustration finally boiling over. Or have you forgotten that? Where was all this concern for family when she was throwing us out on the street? When we had lost everything and she was demanding rent? Tom flinched as if I'd slapped him. That's not fair. I was trying to what, Tom? To keep the peace? To not rock the boat? Well, guess what? The boat's capsized now. And it's time for you to decide where your loyalties lie. We stood there in tense silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. Finally, Tom spoke, his voice quiet and strained. What happens now? I sighed, suddenly feeling very tired. I don't know, Tom. That depends on you, I suppose. And on your mother. As if on cue, Sarah's voice rang out from across the street. Thomas, come back inside this instant. Tom closed his eyes briefly, looking for all the world like a man torn between two worlds. When he opened them again, there was a resignation in his gaze that made my heart ache. I have to go, he said. Mom needs me right now. I nodded, trying to ignore the pain that lanced through me at his words. I understand. But Tom, remember, I need you too. He gave me one last long look before turning and jogging back across the street. I watched as he rejoined Sarah on the porch as they went back inside the house that would soon no longer be theirs. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a nearby car window. I hardly recognized the woman staring back at me. She looked harder, older, her eyes carrying a weight they hadn't before. I wondered, not for the first time, if I had gone too far. If in my quest for justice, I had lost something of myself. But it was too late for such thoughts now. The die had been cast. All that was left was to see how it would fall. I made my way back to the small apartment the bank had provided us as part of our deal. It wasn't much, a tiny one-bedroom with second-hand furniture and peeling wallpaper, but it was ours. Or at least, it was mine. I wasn't sure where Tom stood anymore. As I unlocked the door, I was greeted by Milo's insistent meowing. He wound around my legs, purring loudly, a welcome reminder that no matter what happened, I wasn't entirely alone. I scooped him up, burying my face in his soft fur. What have I done, Milo? I whispered. What happens now? Of course, he had no answers for me. Just a gentle headbutt and more purring. Sometimes that was enough. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, alternating between bouts of frantic activity, cleaning the apartment, organizing our meager belongings, and long periods of sitting and staring at nothing. My phone remained stubbornly silent. No calls from Tom, no messages. The silence was deafening. As evening fell, I found myself standing at the window, looking out at the city lights coming on one by one. The world was moving on, oblivious to the drama playing out in our little corner of it. Life would go on, regardless of what happened next. The question was, what form would that life take? I thought about Sarah, about the look on her face when she realized what had happened. I had wanted her to understand the consequences of her actions, to feel the same helplessness and fear that we had felt. But now that it had happened, I felt no satisfaction. Only a deep, abiding sadness for what had been lost. And Tom, oh Tom. The memory of his face as he walked away from me, back to his mother, was like a knife in my heart. Had I pushed him too far? In my determination to secure our future, had I inadvertently destroyed it? As the night wore on, I found myself unable to sleep. I paced the small apartment, my mind racing with possibilities and regrets. What if Tom never came back? What if, in trying to protect us from Sarah's influence, I had driven him away for good? But then another thought surfaced, small at first, but growing stronger with each passing moment. What if this was the push we needed? What if, by bringing everything out into the open, we could finally build a life free from Sarah's manipulations? It was well past midnight when I heard a key in the lock. My heart leapt into my throat as the door slowly opened, revealing Tom. He looked exhausted, his clothes rumpled, his eyes red-rimmed. But he was here. We stood there for a long moment, just looking at each other. There was so much to say, so many hurts to address, so many decisions to be made. But for now, just having him here felt like enough. "Hi," I said softly, breaking the silence. "Hi," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. And then, without another word, he crossed the room and pulled me into his arms. I melted into his embrace, feeling the tension of the past few days drain out of me. We had a long way to go, I knew. There would be difficult conversations and hard choices ahead. But in that moment, holding each other in the quiet of our tiny apartment, I allowed myself to hope. The fire had changed everything. It had taken our home, our possessions, our sense of security. But maybe, just maybe, from those ashes something new could grow. Something stronger, more resilient. A life built on honesty and mutual support, free from the shadows of the past. As we stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, I realized that this was just the beginning. The real work of rebuilding our life, our relationship, our trust was still ahead of us. But for the first time since that fateful night, I felt ready to face it. Together. The days following the foreclosure of Sarah's house were a blur of emotion and tense conversations. Tom and I existed in a strange limbo, sharing the small apartment, but struggling to bridge the gap that had grown between us. We moved around each other like wary animals, unsure of where we stood or how to begin healing the wounds we'd inflicted on our relationship. It was on a crisp Sunday morning, about a week after the foreclosure, that everything came to a head. I was sitting at our tiny kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee and absently stroking Milo, who was curled up in my lap. Tom emerged from the bedroom, his hair tousled from sleep, his eyes carrying the weight of unspoken words. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from me. For a long moment, we just looked at each other, the silence stretching between us like a chasm. Finally, Tom spoke, his voice low and hesitant. "We need to talk about what happened, Lena." I nodded, my heart racing. This was the conversation I'd been both dreading and longing for. "Yes, we do." Tom took a deep breath, his fingers tapping nervously against his mug. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About the fire, about my mom, about what you did." He paused, his brow furrowing. "I need to know, Lena. Did you have anything to do with my mom's foreclosure?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. I could have lied, could have denied any involvement. But I knew that if we were going to move forward, if there was any hope of salvaging our relationship, I needed to be honest. "Yes," I said softly, meeting his gaze. "I did." Tom's face tightened, a mix of emotions. Flashing across his features, anger, disappointment, confusion. "How could you, Lena? She's my mother. Whatever issues you had with her, this is too far." I felt a flare of defensiveness rise within me. "Issues?" "Tom, she left us homeless. We had lost everything in that fire, and she turned us away unless I paid an exorbitant rent. How can you defend her actions?" "I'm not defending her," Tom shot back, his voice rising slightly. "What she did was wrong, I know that. But this? Orchestrating her financial ruin? That's not the Lena I know. That's not the woman I married." His words stung, but I forced myself to remain calm. "The woman you married was pushed to her limits, Tom. I did what I had to do to secure our future, to make sure we had a roof over our heads. By destroying my mother's life?" Tom's voice cracked with emotion. I leaned forward, my hands clasped tightly around my coffee mug. "I didn't destroy her life, Tom. I uncovered information that was already there. Your mother's financial troubles were of her own making. All I did was make sure the right people saw that information. Tom ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every line of his body. But why, Lena? Why did you have to get involved at all? I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts. How could I make him understand the desperation, the anger, the fear that had driven me? Because I was tired, Tom. Tired of being treated like I was less than, like I didn't belong in your family. Tired of your mother's constant judgment and criticism. And when we lost everything in that fire, when we were at our most vulnerable, and she still couldn't find it in her heart to help us, something in me snapped. I paused, feeling the weight of my next words. And because you didn't stand up for me, Tom, you didn't defend me against her cruelty. I felt alone, abandoned by the one person who was supposed to be on my side no matter what. Tom flinched as if I'd struck him. I didn't know you felt that way, he said softly. I thought I was trying to keep the peace, to find a middle ground. There is no middle ground when it comes to supporting your spouse, Tom, I said, my voice gentle but firm. You can't always straddle the line between your mother and me. Sometimes you have to choose a side. We lapsed into silence again, each lost in our own thoughts. I watched as a myriad of emotions played across Tom's face: guilt, anger, sadness, confusion. Finally, he spoke again. I didn't know she was in financial trouble, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. All those years of living in that big house, the expensive cars, the lavish parties, it was all a facade, wasn't it? I nodded slowly. From what I uncovered, yes. She'd been living beyond her means for years, taking out loans, maxing out credit cards. The foreclosure was inevitable, Tom. I just hastened the process. Tom's shoulders slumped, the weight of this revelation visibly pressing down on him. Why didn't she tell me? I could have helped her, could have done something. Pride, maybe, I suggested gently. Or perhaps she didn't want you to see her as anything less than perfect. Tom laughed bitterly. Perfect? That's a joke. She was far from perfect, wasn't she? I never saw it. Or maybe I didn't want to see it. I reached across the table, tentatively placing my hand over his. To my relief, he didn't pull away. We all have our blind spots when it comes to family, Tom. It's not your fault. He turned his hand, interlacing our fingers. But it is my fault that I didn't support you, Lena. You're right. I should have stood up to her, should have defended you. I was so caught up in trying to please everyone that I ended up hurting the one person I should have been protecting. Tears pricked at my eyes, and I blinked them back. I understand why you did it, Tom. I know how much your mother means to you. I needed you to choose me. Just once, I needed to know that I came first. Tom squeezed my hand, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that took my breath away. You do come first, Lena. You're my wife, my partner, my best friend. I'm so sorry I ever made you doubt that. I felt a weight lift from my chest at his words. It wasn't a solution to all our problems, but it was a start. I'm sorry too, I said softly. I should have talked to you about how I was feeling instead of taking matters into my own hands. I never meant to hurt you, Tom. I hope you know that. He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I know. We both made mistakes, Lena. But we can learn from them, right? We can be better. I returned his smile, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. We can. We have to be. We sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, our hands still intertwined. It felt like a turning point, a moment of understanding that we hadn't had in far too long. But there was still one question nagging at me, one that I needed to ask even though I feared the answer. Tom, I began hesitantly, what happens now? With your mother, I mean. His smile faded, replaced by a look of weary resignation. I don't know, Lena. She's not taking this well. The foreclosure, losing the house, it's like her whole world has collapsed. I felt a pang of guilt. Despite everything Sarah had done, I never wanted to see her truly suffer. Is there anything we can do to help? Tom looked surprised by my offer, but grateful. I've been looking into some options. There's a nice assisted living facility not far from here. It's not as luxurious as she's used to, but it's comfortable and well-maintained. I think it might be good for her. I nodded slowly. That sounds like a good idea. How does she feel about it? Tom sighed heavily. She's resistant, of course. Keeps talking about how she'll bounce back, how this is just a temporary setback. But the reality is, she's not as young as she used to be. Managing a big house on her own, even if she could afford it, it's not practical anymore. And how do you feel about it? I asked gently. He was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing absent patterns on the back of my hand. Honestly, it's hard. Seeing her like this, vulnerable and scared, it's not something I ever expected. But at the same time, I feel relieved, I guess. Like maybe now we can have a more honest relationship without all the pretense and facade. I squeezed his hand supportively. That's understandable, Tom. It's a big change for everyone. Yeah, he agreed softly. Then he looked at me, his eyes searching mine. Lena, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. I tensed. Slightly, but nodded. Of course. What is it? Can you forgive her? He asked. Not right away, maybe, but someday. Can you see a future where we can all coexist, where we can be a family? It was a loaded question, one that I didn't have an easy answer for. I thought about Sarah, about all the hurt and anger between us. But I also thought about Tom, about the love we shared and the future we were trying to build. I don't know, I answered honestly. I can't promise that I'll ever forget what happened, Tom. The way she treated us when we were at our lowest, it cut deep. But I paused, choosing my words carefully. I can promise to try. For you, for us, I can promise to make an effort. Relief washed over Tom's face. That's all I can ask for, he said softly. Thank you, Lena. We fell into silence again, but this time it was comfortable, contemplative. The morning sun streamed through our small kitchen window, casting a warm glow over everything. Milo, who had been quietly observing our conversation, stretched and jumped down from my lap, patting over to his food bowl with a demanding meow. The normalcy of the moment struck me suddenly, sitting here with Tom, drinking coffee, watching our cat demand his breakfast. It was so ordinary, so domestic, and yet it felt precious in a way it never had before. We had come so close to losing all of this. You know, I said, breaking the silence, I've been thinking about the fire a lot lately. Tom looked at me curiously. What about it? Just how quickly everything can change. How fragile our sense of security really is. I paused, gathering my thoughts. We lost so much that night, Tom. Our home, our possessions, nearly our relationship. But we're still here. We survived. Tom nodded slowly. We did. It's been a hell of a journey, hasn't it? I couldn't help but laugh at the understatement. That's one way to put it. But you're right, he continued, his voice growing serious. We survived. And not just the fire, but everything that came after. Your mother, the foreclosure, our own mistakes. We're still standing. I felt a surge of emotion, a mix of pride and love and determination. We are. And we're going to keep standing, Tom. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. He stood up then, coming around the table to pull me into his arms. I went willingly, burying my face in his chest and breathing in his familiar scent. For a moment, we just held each other, drawing strength and comfort from the embrace. When we finally pulled apart, Tom cupped my face in his hands, his eyes shining with unshed tears. I love you, Lena. More than anything. I'm sorry I ever made you doubt that. I love you too, I whispered, feeling my own eyes well up. We're going to be okay, aren't we? He nodded, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. We are. It won't be easy, and we've got a lot of work to do, but we're going to be okay. As we stood there in our tiny kitchen, the morning sun warming our faces, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. We had bridges to rebuild, trust to regain, and a new life to forge. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I was excited about the future. The fire had changed us, there was no denying that. It had stripped away our illusions, forced us to confront hard truths about ourselves and each other. But from those ashes, something new was emerging, a stronger partnership, a deeper understanding, a love tempered by adversity. We had survived the fire. Now it was time to rise from the ashes and build something beautiful from the ruins. The morning sun peeked through the curtains of our new apartment, casting a warm glow across the living room. I sat on the worn couch, cradling a cup of coffee, watching as dust motes danced in the light. It had been 3 weeks since the fire, 3 weeks since our world had been turned upside down. But here we were, still standing, still fighting. Tom emerged from the bedroom, his hair tousled from sleep. He gave me a tired smile as he poured himself a cup of coffee and joined me on the couch. "Morning," he mumbled, his voice still rough with sleep. "Morning," I replied, leaning into him. We sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, both lost in our own thoughts. "So," Tom said finally, "what's the plan for today?" I took a deep breath. "I thought we could start looking for a more permanent place to live. This apartment is great for now, but it's not home," Tom finished for me. I nodded, grateful for his understanding. We spent the day scouring real estate listings, making phone calls, and scheduling viewings. It was exhausting work, but it felt good to be doing something proactive, to be taking steps towards rebuilding our life. As the weeks passed, we fell into a routine. Mornings were spent job hunting. Both of us had lost our positions in the chaos following the fire. Afternoons were dedicated to house hunting. Evenings were for regrouping, planning, and sometimes just holding each other when the weight of everything became too much. It was during one of these evening sessions, about a month after the fire, that Tom brought up the subject of his mother. "I spoke to Mom today," he said quietly, his fingers tracing patterns on my arm. I tensed involuntarily. Sarah had been a sore subject between us since that morning at her house. "How is she?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Tom sighed. "She's struggling. The foreclosure is moving forward. She's going to lose the house." I felt a pang of guilt, quickly followed by a flash of anger. I pushed both aside, focusing instead on Tom. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "I know this must be hard for you." He nodded, his eyes distant. I keep thinking about how different things could have been if she had just helped us that day. If she had shown even a little compassion." I didn't know what to say to that. The hurt was still too raw, the memory of Sarah's cold eyes and cruel words too fresh. Instead, I simply held Tom tighter, offering what comfort I could through my presence. The next day, we had a viewing scheduled for a small brownstone in Jamaica Plain. As we walked up the front steps, I couldn't help but feel a spark of excitement. There was something about this place, something that called to me. The real estate agent, a cheerful woman named Linda, greeted us at the door. "Now, I know it's not much to look at right now," she warned as she led us inside. "But try to see the potential." She wasn't wrong. The place was a mess, peeling wallpaper, scuffed floors, a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. But as we moved from room to room, I found myself falling in love. I could see it all so clearly. The living room painted a warm, inviting color, our books lining the built-in shelves. The kitchen updated with modern appliances, but keeping its charming retro tiles. The small backyard transformed into a cozy oasis, perfect for summer evenings. I glanced at Tom, wondering if he was seeing the same potential. The look on his face told me he was. "What do you think?" I asked softly as Linda gave us a moment alone in what could be our bedroom. Tom smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in weeks. I think it feels like home." We made an offer that day. To our surprise and delight, it was accepted. The process of securing a mortgage and closing on the house was a whirlwind of paperwork and phone calls, but through it all, Tom and I worked as a team. The day we got the keys was a moment of pure joy. We stood on the sidewalk, staring up at our new home, barely able to believe it was real. Tom scooped me up in his arms, spinning me around as we laughed like children. It felt like a new beginning, a fresh start untainted by the pain and struggles of the past few months. Moving in was a challenge, given that we had lost most of our possessions in the fire. But in a way, it was liberating. We were truly starting from scratch, able to build our home exactly as we wanted it. We scoured thrift stores and flea markets, slowly filling our new space with eclectic finds that reflected our personalities far more than our old, carefully curated apartment ever had. One Saturday afternoon, about a month after we'd moved in, I was unpacking a box of kitchen items when I came across the ceramic cat figurine, the one thing we'd salvaged from the fire. I held it in my hands, marveling at how much had changed since that night. Tom found me like that, lost in thought with the figurine cradled in my palms. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "Penny for your thoughts?" he murmured. I leaned back into his embrace, savoring the warmth and security of his presence. "Just thinking about how far we've come," I said. "It's hard to believe sometimes, isn't it, that we made it through all of that?" He pressed a kiss to my temple. "We did more than make it through, Lena. We thrived. Look at us now." And he was right. Despite everything, the fire, Sarah's cruelty, our own mistakes, we had come out stronger. Our relationship, tested by fire both literal and metaphorical, had been forged into something more resilient, more honest, more deeply rooted in mutual understanding and respect. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were still hurdles to overcome, wounds that needed time to heal completely. Chief among these was the situation with Sarah. Tom had been in regular contact with his mother since the foreclosure. She had moved into a small apartment, a far cry from the spacious house she'd once owned. The transition was hard on her, and by extension, on Tom. "I think you should go see her," I said one evening, surprising myself almost as much as I surprised Tom. He looked at me, his eyebrows raised in disbelief. "Really? You'd be okay with that?" I took a deep breath. "I think it's important. She's your mother, Tom. And maybe it's time we all tried to move past what happened." The look of gratitude in Tom's eyes made any residual hesitation I felt worth it. The next day, he went to visit Sarah. I spent the afternoon pacing our new home, alternating between hoping the visit went well and worrying about what it might mean for us if it did. When Tom returned, his eyes were red-rimmed, but there was a lightness to him that I hadn't seen in months. "She asked about you," he said quietly. "Wanted to know if you were okay." I felt a lump form in my throat. "What did you tell her?" "The truth," Tom replied. "That we're doing better. That we're healing. And I told her we'd both like to see her if she's willing." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start. The first visit with Sarah was awkward, tense. We sat in her small living room, making stilted small talk and avoiding any mention of the past. But as we were leaving, Sarah caught my hand. "Lena," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I'm sorry. For everything." I froze, hardly daring to believe what I was hearing. When I looked at her, I saw not the proud, imperious woman who had shut the door in my face, but a tired, vulnerable old lady who had lost everything. "I was wrong," Sarah continued, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "About you, about so many things. I let my pride and my prejudices blind me, and I hurt you both terribly. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I truly am sorry." For a moment, I couldn't speak past the lump in my throat. Then, moving on instinct, I squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you," I said softly. "That means a lot to hear." It wasn't a magical fix, of course. Years of hurt and resentment couldn't be erased with a single apology. But it was a start, a foundation on which we could begin to build a new relationship. As we left Sarah's apartment that day, Tom was quiet, lost in thought. When we got to the car, he turned to me, his eyes shining with emotion. "Thank you," he said, pulling me into a tight hug. "For giving her a chance. For giving us all a chance." I hugged him back, feeling a sense of peace settle over me. "We're family," I said simply. "All of us. It's not always easy, but it's worth fighting for." In the months that followed, we settled into a new rhythm of life. Our brownstone slowly transformed from a house into a home, filled with laughter and love and the occasional squabble over whose turn it was to do the dishes. We hosted dinner parties for friends, planted an herb garden in our tiny backyard, and even adopted a second cat to keep Milo company. I threw myself back into my art, converting the small spare bedroom into a studio. The experience of the fire and its aftermath had changed me, and I found that change reflected in my work. My paintings, once focused on abstract concepts and muted colors, now burst with vivid hues and scenes of resilience and rebirth. Tom, inspired by our journey, decided to start a small nonprofit organization aimed at helping families who had lost their homes to fires or other disasters. He poured his heart and soul into the project, and I watched with pride as he turned our personal tragedy into a force for good in the community. Our visits to Sarah became more frequent and less strained. She never fully returned to her old self. The experience had changed her too profoundly for that, but we found a new way of relating to each other. She became a doting grandmother figure to our cats, always asking for updates on their antics, and even offered to help me plan an exhibition of my new paintings. As for Tom and me, we grew stronger with each passing day. The fire had stripped away our illusions, forced us to confront the cracks in our relationship, but in doing so, it had allowed us to rebuild on a stronger foundation. We communicated more openly, supported each other more fiercely, and loved each other more deeply than ever before. One evening, about a year after the fire, we were sitting on the small stoop of our brownstone, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Tom's arm was around my shoulders, and Milo was curled up at our feet. As I leaned into Tom's embrace, I felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over me. "You know," I said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I never thought I'd say this, but in a way, I'm almost grateful for the fire." Tom looked at me in surprise. "Really? Why's that?" I considered for a moment before answering. "Because it showed us what we're made of. It stripped everything away and forced us to decide what really mattered. And in the end, what mattered was us. Our love, our resilience, our ability to forgive and grow." Tom nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I think I know what you mean," he said. "It's like the fire destroyed our house, but it helped us build a home." I smiled, touched by the simple truth of his words. "Exactly," I said, snuggling closer to him. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, I reflected on our journey. We had been through hell, faced loss and betrayal, confronted our own flaws and weaknesses. But we had emerged from the ashes stronger, more united, more alive than ever before. The fire had taken our possessions, our security, nearly our relationship. But it had given us something far more valuable in return, a deeper understanding of ourselves and each other, a renewed appreciation for the truly important things in life, and the knowledge that together we could weather any storm. As we sat there, bathed in the soft glow of twilight, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges the future might hold, we would face them together. We had risen from the ashes once. We could do it again if we needed to. But more than that, we had learned to cherish each moment, to build a life filled with love, compassion, and gratitude. The fire had been the end of one chapter in our lives, but it had also been the beginning of something beautiful. And as I sat there with Tom, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, I felt nothing but hope and excitement for the chapters yet to come.